agriculture, the importance of innovation. You heard from the secretaries earlier about how important that productivity gain is. So they're going to be talking about that, but also be talking about that it's appropriate that we have the right level of regulation so that we not only are assuring the science, but we aren't so heavy-handed that we're stifling technology and that can lead to disastrous consequences, not only for productivity and for farmers and ranchers, but also for consumers and all of mankind. Here to moderate this panel, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Sarah Wyant. A lot of you will know Sarah. She is the president and founder of AgriPulse Communications, which is a diversified communications firm. You will know it from those of you from the things like the Daily Harvest, the Daybreak, the Drive Time, the emerging updates that you might receive during the day on various issues, as well as, of course, the flagship weekly newsletter that does an in-depth dive in all that is happening in the food and agriculture world. Sarah is known across the country. She's well known on Capitol Hill as well. In 2015, she was named one of the top women in media. She also has received an Oscar, not from the Motion Picture Association, but from the American Agriculture Editors Association for excellence in journalism. She is a past president of the American Agriculture Editors Association, is past chairwoman of the Farm Foundation Board of Trustees. She's a farm girl that was raised in Iowa. She and her husband, Alan Johnson, still own the family farm up in North Dakota that Alan's ancestors had homesteaded up there in North Dakota. So please join with me in welcoming Sarah Wyant.
Well, thank you, Deputy Sensky, for that very nice introduction, and good morning to all of you. There we go. I don't know about you, but I am really glad to be here and not in a snowstorm or an ice storm, and it's supposed to be 50-something degrees when you get done with today, so just come to Washington more often and you'll see a lot of things change, except perhaps the federal government. So I am really pleased to be here to serve as moderator with all these distinguished panelists that we have on board. The official title, of course, is Evolving Regulatory Landscapes and Adoption of Precision Biotechnology Crop and Livestock Innovations. And I'm sure if you were in DC for long enough, there'd be an acronym for this. But for now, we have the long title, and it is going to encompass a lot of different areas. I have to say that I've been very pleased to be digging into this issue over the last couple of years and the excitement that precision breeding holds. Our team did a deep dive in a 7-part series on biotech called The Breeding Edge last year. And when you start to talk to industry officials, not only about the implications for agriculture, but for human health, it's very, very exciting. But one thing I can tell you is that we also hear from the industry is that there is a frustration over the lack of regulatory progress. And many people have applauded USDA for all the great work that they've been doing under the Trump administration for the focus on eliminating or streamlining burdensome regulations. In fact, we did some research of farmers across the country a couple years ago, and the one issue that was unanimously agreed upon by small farmers, large farmers, East Coast, West Coast, Democrats, Republicans, is that there's too much red tape in U.S. agriculture. However, we all know regulatory reform is not just about eliminating burdensome regulations, it's also about getting the regulatory process right so that the consumers can have the trust in their food the Secretary talked about this morning. So we've got 4 great speakers to share their thoughts on some of the changes ahead, and I'm going to introduce them briefly, and then each of them will come up to the podium for their presentations. First off, we've got Governor Pete Ricketts from Nebraska, sworn in as the state's 40th governor on January 8th, 2015. Prior to his governorship, he held leadership roles in Ameritrade, including Senior VP in Business Development and Chief Operating Officer. I was also excited to know that he serves as a director for the Chicago Cubs baseball team. Go Cubs. Governor Ricketts earned his bachelor's degree in biology and has an MBA in marketing and finance from the University of Chicago. So probably a longtime Cubs fan, I guess, right? Yeah. Last fall, he also helped launch a biotech connector in his state, trying to help new startups on biotechnology. Next, you'll hear from Barb Glenn, a very familiar face to many in this room, who's the CEO of the National Association of State Departments of Agriculture. Dr. Glenn's a scientist with decades of experience as a policy researcher and an advocate for agriculture. She previously worked at both CropLife America and the Biotech Industry Association in Washington, D.C. She holds a BS in animal science and a PhD in ruminant nutrition from the University of Kentucky, and she still lives on a small farm in Maryland with her husband, 3 children, serves on various boards, and is an active advocate for 4-H. Glad you're here, Barb. Next is Mitch Abrahamson, who's Executive Vice President for Recombinetics, a firm that's doing some very exciting things with gene-edited pigs and other livestock. Prior to Recombinetics, he was a Senior VP of Research and Development for Tyson Foods and also worked for Colgate-Palmolive. Dr. Abrahamson received a bachelor's degree in biochemistry from the University of Minnesota and a PhD in biochemistry from the University of Washington. Thanks, Mitch. Last on our panel will be Jack Bobo, again, no stranger to many of you in this room, who's currently the Vice President of Intrexon. Jack is the Vice President for Global Policy and Government Affairs, and he has been very, very active on this front, not only in that role, but as a person who's been watching these developments around the globe, where he worked at the U.S. Department of State. In 2015, he was named by Scientific American as one of the 100 most influential people in biotechnology. And I think you'll see from his presentation, Jack really knows his stuff. So with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Governor Ricketts.
Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Oh, you were much faster that time. Good job. You knew that was coming. Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for the opportunity to be here today. Appreciate it. I want to thank Secretary Perdue and the USDA for holding this conference and give us the opportunity to talk about these really important issues. So you may ask yourself, with all these great experts up there, why am I the governor of Nebraska here? Well, frankly, when she was doing the introductions, I was asking myself the same thing. And I think the reason they asked me to be on here is because one of the things we governors think about is how do we create more opportunities in our state? And that's one of the big questions we have in agriculture, as well as being a governor from an agricultural state like Nebraska. And I'm sure I don't have to repeat the statistics to you, but I do want to highlight what the opportunities and the mission is. That by 2050, it's projected there will be 2 billion more people on the face of this earth. And because of rising standards of living in places like Asia, we will have to produce 100% more food. That's doubling the food. And because we're not making any more land, 70% of that is going to have to come from productivity and innovation. That's the opportunity we have in front of us, and the mission. Now, coming from Nebraska, where agriculture is our #1 industry, this is a big deal. Agriculture is over 20% of our state's economy. It counts for about 1 in 4 jobs. And as a governor, I know my fellow governors feel the same way as well, our mission is to help create opportunities for the people of our state. And if we're going to grow the state of Nebraska, which is the vision for my administration, we've got to grow agriculture. So how do we think about doing that? Well, we think about doing that in a variety of ways. One of the focuses for my administration has been to cut the regulatory red tape, take down those obstacles for job creators, make it easy for us to be able to create jobs and innovate. We also think about growing agriculture through trade. Trade's a very important aspect of that. 30% of everything we grow goes overseas. And opening up those markets is key for us to be able to do that. And then finally, another key aspect of that, being able to grow our state, is value-added agriculture. And that comes in a variety of different ways. Livestock is probably the biggest opportunity. Livestock takes what we grow, whether it's the corn or soybeans, and turn it into something that is more valuable, that beef, pork, poultry. And we want to be able to, again, get back to the trade thing, be able to export that overseas. So that's kind of the fundamentals about how we think about this. Now, then you tie into, well, why is this important? Well, for both those missions, innovation is critical. How do we continue to meet the needs of a growing world and be able to create those job opportunities in our state? And let's just take a look at this historically. So if you look from like 1866 to about 1939, the average production of corn on a farm was about 26 bushels an acre. Didn't really change. It was pretty flatlined throughout that entire period. But then, when the use of hybrid seeds came in, nitrogen fertilizer, herbicides, all that innovation, when that came in the 1940s, that growth skyrocketed to an average of maybe about 154 bushels of corn. So if you look at where we've been in that time frame, and think about this, it wasn't that long ago. My grandfather was a farmer back in the 1930s and 40s. So that was only a couple generations prior to me. We've gone for about 6 times the productivity. We're growing 5 times as much corn as in this country today as we were back in the 30s on 20% less land. If you look at the beef industry, we can produce the same amount of beef as we did in 1977 with 33%, a third fewer animals. Whether you're looking at corn or beef or any other industry, that is happening because of innovation. Because we are continuing to progress the science. And so we need to continue to facilitate that. And it's actually one of the things I'll compliment USDA on. They do a great job of that when they think about how they're regulating, for example, plants. If it's something you could do with plants that you could do through natural selection, going back to like Gregor Mendel, right? The father of modern genetics in the 19th century when he did his work on pea plants, it really started this work on genetics. If you can do that same sort of thing, it's not something that really needs to be regulated. And that's the way the USDA has kind of taken that approach. That's allowed for that innovation, that has allowed for that, that 5 or 6 times the productivity that we have today. And in fact, just on that aside, I talked about the average of 154. A friend of mine shot me a screenshot when he was out in the field last fall, 305 bushels an acre is that he was hitting. Isn't that amazing? And that's where technology is going. And we've got to continue to facilitate that. And if you look at other job opportunities we can create along those same lines in agriculture, that's huge too, because it creates those great paying jobs. We've got to allow for this innovation to be able to feed that growing world and to create jobs in our states. So for example, there's a company, which I'm sure Mitch is going to be talking about a little bit as well, but DNA Genetics. They're a Nebraska-based company. About 40% of the pork in this country has some of their genetics. I was just actually at they opened a facility in rural Saunders County in Nebraska. It's a $3 million investment. It's going to employ about 10 people, payroll of about $500,000. And when their gene transfer facility is fully up and running with all the technology implemented, they'll probably impact about 5 million pigs a year. Again, that advancement in technology, helping us to do a better job of feeding the world and creating jobs, especially in our rural communities. That's key. Or think about Zoetis. They're the largest manufacturer of pet vaccines, but they also work in the livestock industry. They employ about 670 people in Nebraska. They go to 100 countries around the world. GeneSeek is another Nebraska-based company that does about 4 million DNA tests every year to help breeders improve livestock, to make sure we've got more productive, healthier food for our tables. All these companies are using innovation and science to be able to meet that mission of feeding a growing world and creating jobs in Nebraska. And if you look at the biotech sector in Nebraska, you're creating like 16,000 jobs, over 1,000 companies. It's 42% more concentrated in Nebraska than it is in other places. And creating those great paying jobs. If you're looking at somebody coming out with an undergraduate degree as a biologist, biochemist, or something getting involved in this field, they're making at least $50,000 to start with. So these are the types of jobs that are helping us create those opportunities for people in Nebraska. And that's why it's so important that we continue to allow innovation to be able to meet that need of feeding a growing world, doubling that food supply over the next 20-odd years, and making sure we're creating opportunities in states like Nebraska for young people to find those job opportunities, find their careers in our state, and help grow our #1 industry. And that's why I think they asked me to be on this panel, because both those missions are critical for the success of our state, the success of Nebraska, and indeed all of agriculture across this country. So what can we do? Well, at the state level, we have to make sure we continue to cut that regulatory red tape, that we're putting policies in place to be able to help grow agriculture, and that we're making sure we're training our people, connecting people to those jobs. I've introduced, for example, grant programs and scholarship programs to be able to start at 7th and 8th grade and helping young people see about these great careers. At the federal level, what can we do? Well, again, opening up trade opportunities is going to be a key thing. Reaching out to new markets and expanding existing markets. And then finally, one of the things I think some of the other folks are going to talk about as well is making sure we have smart regulation, not putting up obstacles. It's one of the things at the state of Nebraska I focus a lot on, making sure that we're not putting up those regulatory obstacles. Same sort of deal. We want to have smart regulation. We certainly want to make sure that we're doing a good job of creating a level playing field for everybody, but we cannot create obstacles and barriers to innovation, because we're not going to be able to grow jobs or feed a growing world if we're not allowing our companies to innovate. I know that our farmers and ranchers are up to the task. We just got to make sure that we create the environment, both at the state and federal level, for them to be successful. So again, thank you all very much for giving me the opportunity here today. I look forward to our other panelists and more discussion with regard to how we can continue to feed a growing world and be successful in creating innovation here in our country and be globally competitive. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning. Thank you. I would like to thank Secretary Perdue for the opportunity to participate in the USDA Outlook Forum. NASDA, the United Voice for State Departments of Agriculture, represents the commissioners, secretaries, and directors who are the co-regulatory partners with USDA. Together, USDA and NASDA both play also an important role in growing markets, in agricultural promotion, and ag education. And we do that for all methods of agricultural production. And we do that across the states and across the nation together. Adoption of precision biotechnology innovation, then, for crops and livestock, in our mind, requires not only a robust regulatory system, but a strong federal and state partnership as well. So the commissioners are the state partner in that federal regulatory program. NASDA members focus on outreach and education. We work with farmers on a day-to-day basis, for example, on biotech cropping systems. How do we adopt some of the new traits and the new inputs and outputs? We expect to do the exact same thing with animal biotechnology. Biotech makes a powerful contribution to agriculture, making our sector a driver of the U.S. economy, with fully 20% of American farm revenue coming from exports. American ag is currently facing, as we all know, many uncertainties that could drastically impact our overall global competitiveness. Over the next years, American farmers and ranchers could be offered an extensive array of animal and plant biotechnology products that could revolutionize the food production in this country. So let's start with plants. The benefits of plants are numerous. Plant biotech includes agronomic traits that enhance the environment, provide resistance to disease and pests, and there's quite a lot of work on drought tolerance, and the list is very long. There's a relatively recent, but not new anymore, focus on consumer health traits, including over 10 new soybean varieties with human health benefits that are moving toward commercialization right now. Other next-gen biotech crops give us more choices, so this is good. Apples and potatoes we're going to hear about that are not likely to spoil. Super sweet pineapple, and in Brazil, commercialization approval for an insect-resistant sugarcane. In some developing countries, crop yields increase tenfold when using biotech, and they increase farmers' incomes in every country that uses biotechnology. When farmers benefit in those countries, their communities benefit as well. So the bottom line is that in 2017, the U.S. reached an average adoption rate of 94.5% for the plantings of biotech soybeans, corn, and cotton. Great success story. Something is working well. So NASDA is excited about the potential for gene editing because new plant traits can be introduced more rapidly and precisely, potentially saving years or even decades in bringing new innovation to farmers. We support USDA's announcement last year that they will not regulate gene-edited plants that could otherwise be derived from traditional breeding. We also support the 2018 international statement that was signed by 13 countries in support of gene editing. And indeed, in the USMCA, as you all know, in the SPS chapter, where we've bolstered our support for biotechnology, for the first time, gene editing has been mentioned in that text. So life is good. There are many challenges, yes, in the area of plant biotech, and we're revamping the regs to be more risk-based, working together. Basically, domestically, the regulation of plant biotechnology is working. Plants are so far ahead of animals. The picture for livestock and poultry and the innovation that the governor wants in Nebraska is less clear because of the dysfunctional regulatory landscape. Animal ag is a major contributor to the U.S. economy. We're right there next to the crops, aren't we? Adoption of animal biotech could give the U.S. a competitive advantage over countries that are moving quickly on the adoption of these technologies, such as Brazil and Argentina. Cash receipts in 2018 are expected to be for animals and animal products about $178 billion. And then the meat and dairy industries that purchase that livestock, $318 additional billion in output. So looking forward, new biotechnology focus on gene editing offers this huge potential to improve animal health and animal welfare. Gene editing has no more risk than traditional breeding. Gene editing shows strong potential to eliminate, for example, the need to dehorn cattle, specifically dairy cattle here, to confer resistance to viral diseases of livestock and poultry, and reduce the need for antibiotic use in livestock. We have successfully already used biotech to produce animals that are resistant to, I'll mention just 3. We talked about African swine fever this morning. Wouldn't it be nice if we had a tool for resistance? But we're talking about animals already on the ground, resistant to avian influenza, resistance to PRRS virus, or porcine reproductive and respiratory syndrome virus, and in addition, foot and mouth disease. Each of these diseases costing us well over $1 billion a year, or when there's an outbreak, even more in the case of AI. But these animals are not in the marketplace. In order to realize the potential of animal biotech, the regulatory program needs to evolve. Currently, FDA has taken the lead on animal biotechnology approvals, given its current statutory authority, and is regulating animal biotechnology traits as new animal drugs. And I'll say quotes because it comes from the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. However, not a single food animal derived from biotechnology is currently available in the United States. The only FDA-approved biotech food animal is the genetically engineered salmon that we'll probably hear more about. It grows more efficiently, but not larger. And this took a 20-year review of the genetic construct when it's defined as a new animal drug. Clearly, for livestock and poultry, the current regulatory path is broken. It's not risk-based. It's not getting the animals and the animal products to market. The chilling effect on R&D is severely inhibiting the emergence of these animals. The valuable benefits that we just talked about are not being realized. So from NASDA's perspective, farmers need the animals and we need the products. The current situation is putting U.S. farmers and ranchers behind other countries that already have regulatory programs, and by the way, they already have approved gene-edited livestock and poultry. The current U.S. regulatory program then is putting U.S. farmers behind their international counterparts. Worse, the U.S. is going to import animal products from afar, from those countries that are already ahead of us. There's no ability to test for a gene edit. There's no ability to track a gene-edited animal. The animals obviously aren't new animal drugs. The products are as safe and the same as products from every other animal developed through traditional breeding. Meanwhile, the livestock producers in those countries have the added benefit of a more efficient and healthy livestock production system. So if U.S. farmers had access to gene-edited animals, they could enhance profitability and keep up with the global market, and we'd have all those benefits I talked about. So what do? How do we change the regulatory landscape? As state regulators, NASDA notes that we need massive amounts of more collaboration that's necessary among the federal agencies to develop a process that works. We strongly support USDA having a seat at that table. USDA has the expertise in agricultural animal science and health. NASDA stands ready to work with the federal agencies, but a timely solution is needed. This is almost a crisis that has to provide commercialized applications that farmers and ranchers can put in practice on their farm in Nebraska and all the rest of the states and territories. We need a regulatory system that, yes, it has to preserve high standards necessary to ensure food safety, animal health, and environmental protection. It has to focus on the characteristics of the product and not the process that was used to develop it, that animal. And it needs to be a regulatory review that minimizes burden while ensuring protection of public health and welfare. But at the same time, we must foster innovation for all the reasons we heard about already today. So I would end with this. Finally, and perhaps more importantly, for both plant and animal biotech, there's an urgent need to provide transparency, and it's what Secretary Perdue said this morning: communicate, communicate, communicate. The changing face of food retail isn't going away, folks. Consumers are seeking many choices, aren't they, in their food experience? Some of them I don't even understand, but particularly the millennials and my son, who's a Gen Zer, lots of opportunity there. So we must do a better job of communicating with our youth and with all consumers. NASDA members interact with consumers every day. We have conversations, we share fact-based messages, we support and encourage education of consumers to increase the understanding of these technologies. That is paramount. And we realize that as we do this, as we all realize we're in this together, the rural economy is going to rise, and we all rise. So I guess in summary, I'd just say now is the time to bring the new plant and also the new livestock innovations to adoption, so we have farmers that grow locally and sustainably, they sell globally and competitively, and they do that to benefit consumers of all generations who simply want access to the safest, affordable, and most nutritious food products. So thanks for letting me have time to speak today. Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today. A reminder to I have some slides I'm looking to tee up here. Thank Secretary Perdue's office for the invitation and USDA staff for putting together this forum for us to talk about some of the regulatory hurdles that are really in the way of preventing us from effectively and efficiently commercializing some of the opportunities around gene editing that are available, and really talk about our focus on improving animal health and welfare as we start addressing some of the issues of what it's going to take to keep feeding the world. Recombinetics, as a technology platform, we edit non-human cells. We edit non-human cells, but we have applications within human biomedical, both from a disease model standpoint for improving their ability to drive pharmaceutical industry, as well as regenerative medicine programs to take advantage of the opportunity to use swine models to produce human therapeutics. Both of these business models have known regulatory pathways within FDA that are functional. They work for us. We've participated in those systems and clearly are meeting the needs of the industry and ourselves in bringing this technology forward. When it comes to Excelligen, which is our food animal business, as just mentioned, we are regulated as a drug with our food animal products, and this is really an unclear and inhibitory process to bring these products to market. We need to be regulated based on risk or novelty of the product and not based on the process involved in generating these products, and we'll talk about how we do that. This is really about accelerating genetic improvement to address issues in global farming. We're focused on naturally occurring genes. The animals are not novel. These animals exist in different populations around the world. And we can achieve this through traditional breeding programs, but they take 20, 30, 40, 50 generations to accomplish that. We can do this in a single generation and deliver that benefit where we get healthy animals, address issues around antibiotic-free production, disease resistance, address societal's interest in how our animals are raised and some of the welfare concerns we have, and really start addressing other issues about the impact in the environment and how do we take advantage of innovation technology to really drive the performance that we're looking for out there. And this isn't a technology looking for a problem. This is really the problems that are out there that the genetics companies and the consumers are challenged with, and bringing the right solution, the right technology to the table to address those problems. And I think if we focus on what are the issues that we're trying to address and look at the opportunity to take a very safe and effective way to address those problems, the technology comes to light in a little different view. What are the problems out there in Europe? Mechanical castration of male pigs is banned. We need a solution if we're going to address those legal requirements that are out there and really address, I guess, the welfare that people are interested in addressing when we start thinking about our livestock production systems. Dehorning of cattle. The picture in the bottom left, animals with horns, animals without horns. The one with horns goes through a process of removing those horns. There are hornless cattle out there. In the dairy industry, they just happen to not be the ones associated with the elite milk production characteristics we're looking for. The ability to use gene editing and generate the animal on the right, which is hornless, healthy, normal, undistinguishable from other naturally occurring animals out there, provides a solution without sacrificing the performance and economics that we're looking for in our animal production systems. If we start talking about addressing some issues in the tropics and bringing effective and efficient production systems to these areas, 2/3 of the global cattle population are in this zone where essentially the genetics that we have today, developed in temperate regions, do not effectively provide that resource available in these zones. There are animals in these zones that are adapted. They can tolerate the heat, they can tolerate the disease, they can tolerate the pathogens, and we know what those gene variants are, and they already naturally exist. We're able to bring that knowledge into our effective populations, our elite populations, and change the way we think about animal production. If we can provide heat tolerance to dairy cattle and move them into these zones, we can decrease the number of animals 7, 8, 9-fold required to produce the same amount of product. And so today our leaded genetics are not adapted to these regions. If we wanted to start a breeding program, we're talking about 40, 50, 60 years to make this happen. But we can address this issue in single or 2 generations through precision breeding, where again we take those natural variants that exist and we move those variants into our elite populations. This is a picture of Ginzelli. She is a Red Angus that's down in Brazil. She has been gene edited to be heat tolerant, single nucleotide change. Had a great article in the Wall Street Journal, great video, it's fun to watch. This is a happy, healthy animal. She enjoys being down there in the tropics. And if you look at this picture, which is actually one of those, a picture's worth 1,000 words, if you look on the left side, those are Angus calves, and there's 3 of them, and they're lined up in the shadow of that tree. And they're trying to hide from that heat and do anything they can to be comfortable, because it clearly is a welfare concern when we try to put these animals down there. On the right, there's Ginzelli. She has actually already ate today, and she's looking to be out there playing in the full-blown sun. Again, she's healthy, happy, normal, looks like any other animal that we would have on the ground, but she has a gene edit for heat tolerance that already exists in this region. So our commercialization and co-development process involves partnerships with global genetics companies where we already work with elite genetics that's available. We don't have to develop new genetics. They already have the animal production systems, they have distribution networks, and they have a customer base. So we're out there within different agricultural models looking at what are the gaps, what things need to be addressed around welfare, heat tolerance, disease resistance, been talked about multiple times today. We're in the middle of a tripartite agreement for funding from multiple nations to develop TB resistance for our dairy cattle. Gene editing provides that opportunity to do that. We talked about castration-free, you've heard about PRRS, FMDV is another one. In our aquaculture programs, some of the environmental concerns we have over aquaculture and I'll say invasive species or release of animals that would come out and potentially mate with wild strains, that can be addressed as well through gene editing. We have contracted partners out there. They're interested, they understand the value, but they're nervous because of the regulatory uncertainty. So we have a partnership with CEMEX, Canadian-based company, moving forward with polled hornless animals within their program. Governor talked about our partnership with DNA Swine Genetics. We also have a partnership in here with Hendrix Genetics, which is a European-based multi-species genetics company that understands the importance of animal welfare, that understands the importance of animal health and are concerned about how we raise our animals and participating in this program to address these concerns. Pork producers are out there with some strong statements and their concerns about not having access to this technology and being very supportive of what we need to do. But the U.S. is clearly not the first mover in this area. We need to make sure they're not the last mover. We've had success in other regions in the world in getting our products approved. We actually have countries coming to us to ask us to put animals through their system and prove that their regulatory process is effective and safe. And these early adopters are really going to drive global business development models. Once you start moving animals around the world, once you establish production systems, they're not coming back. These are multi-million-dollar operations, huge multiplication chains, huge multiplication pipelines and distribution networks that need to be out there to support the animals in our food chain. And so the need to commercialize is really driving our efforts to seek regulatory approval outside the U.S. for our products. And we're focused on those countries where the pathway is defined and it's regulated based on the product and the novelty and the safety of the product, not the process involved. Brazil gave us approval that our gene-edited dairy calves, hornless, are not GMO. We have an application through right now for heat tolerance in Brazil as well. We have applications going through Argentina as well. We're working with a Canadian partner to go through the Canadian system. If we look outside the U.S., there's lots of friendlier environments out there where we're participating. We have global partners. More importantly, the impact on this commercial opportunity is significant. And the U.S. is putting many of our producers and genetics programs in a competitive disadvantage out there. You see a big red dot there for pin for China. We have some great IP that's covered in China. We heard today about the number of animals that are produced in China. China is clearly looking at the ways to use this technology to solve issues around disease resistance, to provide food security for the country, which is what they're focused on, and that opportunity is a, I'll say, attractive position for someone like Recombinetics as well. So the challenge is to provide those genetic improvements. Again, we're focused on naturally occurring genes. These can be produced through traditional breeding programs, but it takes a long time, and we see economic, I'll say, progress inhibited by doing that. But we need risk-based assessment of the product safety, and the animals we're producing are not novel. The product is not novel. We're a Minnesota-based company. This is a U.S.-developed technology, U.S.-funded technology. We've had over $20 million in competitive grants, but our commercialization partners are nervous. I have steering committee meetings every quarter, and every quarter the first topic is, what's the U.S. doing on the regulatory front? And that's slowed down our ability to connect with some other partners out there. So, new breeding technologies are scientifically sound. They've been proven effective. 2 years ago, we talked about, does the technology work? Today, we're talking about how do we get the technology out there. Supported by many of the trade associations. We talked about the pork producers making strong statements. We've got commercial partners lined up. We need to get through some of the regulatory hurdles that are out there that are expensive and time-consuming and difficult for companies like ourselves. So our position is that these animals are not transgenic, these are not novel animals, these are applications of traditional breeding methods based on variation that's already out there, and we need to regulate the product, not the process. And we need a risk-based assessment of the product and safety to support our programs. And with that, I thank you very much for the time.
Well, it's a pleasure for me to be here as well. It's a pleasure for a lot of reasons, one of which I spent 13 years traveling around the world talking about the future of food, and at every presentation I gave, they would say, I thought we invited USDA. And I would say, no, the State Department, we care about food too. And they say, well, what's the difference between what you do at the State Department and what they do at USDA? And I'd say, well, that's easy. At USDA, they do things. At the State Department, we talk about doing things. I suspect there are a lot more doers in this room, so bear with me. I have some slides here as well. How many people in the room have heard of Intrexon? Raise your hand. That's a little disappointing since I'm somewhat responsible for communicating the role of Intrexon. Okay, well, we're going to work on that. Actually, I'm hoping that that'll change by the end of this conversation, because I like to say it's the coolest company you've never heard of. And we'll see if you agree by the end of the talk. Now, Governor Ricketts talked about some of the opportunity, but the challenges are great in feeding a growing population. And 40% of all the land on Earth is already being used for agriculture. The amount of cropland is the size of South America, the amount of pasture land the size of Africa. So we need to produce that 70 to 100% more food on exactly the same footprint, if not smaller, than we're using today. 70% of all fresh water, as you know, goes to agriculture. The Colorado River, the fifth longest river in America, no longer flows to the sea. So these aren't the challenges of 2050. These are the realities of today. Yeah. Okay. Well, okay, sorry. I've got the law of Mike. I was hoping it was working. I like to walk and talk. So these are challenges, though, for all of us. We have 800 to 850 million people who will go to bed tonight hungry. We have up to 9 million people who die every year of hunger. And it's really hard for the public to wrap their minds around that because it's such a big number. So let's put it into perspective. That's 25,000 people will die today of hunger. That's 1,000 people over the next hour. That's one person every 4 seconds. So how do we get people to care more about that one child and understand that that child is not a statistic? So that's some of the challenges. And I mention that because that's the context for this conversation we're having today. Innovation isn't in isolation. It's not just about jobs, though jobs are really important. It's about people, and it's about livelihoods. So let me give you a little bit of background on the company. Now, we started out as a healthcare company, which is why it's called Intrexon. And we have 24 human therapeutics. We're fighting cancer and skin diseases and eye diseases and doing human gene therapy, and nobody ever writes or talks about those things. It's not controversial to try to stop cancer. We're also using energy. We're using methanotrophs that naturally consume methane and turning that into gasoline and other high-value chemicals. But today I'm going to talk mostly about plants and animals. We have facilities around the country and around the world. I'll get to some of those as well. But I want to start with plants. So I asked you if you knew Intrexon. How many of you have heard of the Arctic apple, the non-browning genetically engineered apple? That's one of our companies. And it's an important product. I like to say it's the most important GMO in the history of the world, because it's the only GMO that people will buy because it's a GMO rather than in spite of the fact it's a GMO. It's the science that makes it cool. It's the science that makes it special. And if you have kids and you send apple slices to school with your kids and they eat them, that's great. And people understand that consumer benefit. And we need more products that people want and love if we want to change the nature of these conversations. But it's not just about apples that people will eat. It's also about food waste. Apples are the third most wasted food item in America. About 40% of all apples are wasted Everybody always asks at the end of the conversation, what's 1 and 2? Bread and potatoes. Simplot has non-browning potatoes as well. And so it's important because every person who touches our apples in the supply chain benefits. If you're a grower, there's less waste. If you're a shipper or a retailer, and of course most food waste occurs at the consumer level, and so they save too. Now sometimes people will say, you know, I eat brown apples, and I ask, well, but do you buy them at the grocery store? You know, I think most of us skip over those brown apples and we pick something else, and so at the end of the day, they all get thrown away. Well, you'll never throw away an Arctic apple. And so these things are small, but they matter because we all do things every day that, you know, we know might not be good for us, but there's something in it, we like it. And as soon as you can deliver products that people want and love, you change the nature of the conversation. And it's really important that we change the nature of this conversation because it's so important. Now, I like to say that people love innovation almost as much as they despise change. And there's no place they despise change more than in the food they eat. Because food is what brings us together as family, with friends, and if you mess with my food, you're messing with my family, and people don't like that. But if we don't change how we produce food, everything will change. We need to turn food innovation into something that people want and love. So I'm going to talk a little more about animal biology and biotechnology. How many of you have heard of the Aqua Bounty salmon? Fast-growing salmon, that's also one of our products. Achieves normal size in half the time, doesn't grow twice as fast. How we talk about things matters. And so it's just one product, but in the United States, nearly 95% of all of the Atlantic salmon consumed in this country is imported today. So it's an opportunity as well, $3 billion worth of salmon that could be produced here in the United States, sustainably, nutritiously, and locally. It's about local jobs, it's about rural America, it's investing in rural America. Hundreds of millions of dollars for each facility. Good paying jobs. Now, the Aqua Bounty salmon was approved for commercial consumption in 2015. Now, one would hope or think that that would mean that it's on the market, but of course that's not the case. Because we're still waiting on FDA to finalize its guidance on how the product should be labeled. Now, you might think, I thought USDA had that job and they did it. But you'd be wrong. FDA still needs to issue its final guidance. Now, this is important because if the first biotech animal in the world never reaches market, there will never be a second. So it's not just about one product, it's about all products. And this question of labeling, if every new product has to worry that some member of Congress is going to pass a law or add an amendment to some rule that requires different labeling than the USDA regulations for genetically engineered products, well, again, that undermines our entire regulatory system. You know, why would companies invest? Why would investors put their money into products that can never reach the market? Especially when they have enormous commercial opportunities for people, safer, healthier, no sea lice, no vaccinations, just good, fresh products. So we have to find a way of making these products available. Do we have any livestock producers in the room? Have you heard of Transova Genetics, one of the largest livestock producers? That's one of our companies as well. And again, we're also the largest animal cloning company in the United States through our subsidiary Viagen. We do all things controversial, but that's okay. Because these are important technologies, and we believe firmly in the future. But I'm a science optimist. I have no doubt that we can develop the technologies and achieve the goals that we need by 2050. But I have to tell you, I'm a regulatory pessimist. I'm not at all convinced that we'll be allowed to go there. And that really depends on consumer acceptance. And a lot of that responsibility falls on us. Don't get me wrong. We have to be worthy of the consumer's trust. That's our job. It's not their job. We need to be transparent. We need to engage in a way that we have not done before. So we need to own that, and we need to find ways of overcoming it because it's really important. When you ask consumers about sustainability, about 60 or 70% say it's very important when they make purchases. But then when you ask them, well, what does sustainability mean to you? They often say, reduce pesticides and more affordable. Well, those two things might actually work against each other. So the challenge that we have is that what consumers ask for and what they want may not be the same thing. And so surveys that ask people what they want to consume don't necessarily tell you the whole story. Sure, 90% of Americans want to know if there are GMOs in their food, but they also want to know if there's DNA in their food. So we need to understand not just what they're asking for. You know, people say yes to everything when you ask them about labeling, but fundamentally what they care about is safe and nutritious and healthy food. And so we need to make sure that they believe that the food that they're getting is safe. Now, another one of our companies is EnviroFlight, and it produces black soldier fly. So again, one of the products that we're working on, we built the largest facility in the United States down in Kentucky. How many of you have heard of Oxitec? Produces the genetically engineered mosquitoes fighting Zika. That's another one of our companies. It also does other work with fall armyworm and diamondback moth and medfly and olive fly and all of these different things. So they're huge opportunities. But the regulatory challenges are great. When Zika hit back in 2016, we encouraged FDA to use its emergency use authority in order to accelerate the approval of our genetically engineered mosquitoes. And FDA took the position that an animal drug was not a drug for purposes of emergency use. Now, when I was in elementary school, I learned that the subset of a set is part of the set, but apparently not. And so we worked with Congress, and they amended the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and they made clear that an animal drug was in fact a drug. And the day that we met with FDA to talk about how to exercise its new authority, it said, well, don't you know, this morning we published draft guidance transferring jurisdiction of your product to EPA. 10 months later, they effectuated that transfer in the midst of the Zika crisis. And, you know, a year and a half later, we're still waiting to start the first field trial. I guess it wasn't that much of an emergency. So again, if people don't act in a way that demonstrates that these are emergencies, then nothing can happen. So the regulatory challenges are great, and we need to find a way of working through it. And so to me, it doesn't matter whether it's a political roadblock or it's a broken regulatory system if you can't get products out the other side. So one of the last points I'd like to make before we break for the conversation is, when U.S. regulators and trade officials travel overseas and they meet with other governments to talk about trade barriers and they talk about political roadblocks, if I was on the other side of that table, I would just say, Aqua Bounty. And then I would say, well, is it politics or is it a broken system? And then wait. And the fact is, if the U.S. can't bring products to market, there's no way that we can convince other countries that they should do the same. If we don't have the political will or the scientific and technical expertise to review products, then we can't be surprised if other countries can't do it. Because we're the leader. We're the ones who are developing these technologies. People look to us first, and the first question they ask is it approved in the United States? Can your consumers eat these products? And if the answer is no, you're in trouble. And so gene-edited products were mentioned. We have a gene-edited tilapia that we've developed with Aqua Bounty. Of course, we have not submitted that product for review in the United States. We took it first to Argentina, which looked at it carefully and determined that it was not a GMO for purposes of their regulation. It would be treated just as any other introduced species and go through the same environmental assessments of any other product. So companies aren't even entering the U.S. regulatory process. If you were to ask FDA, they would say, well, nobody's coming to us, so our process must be working. It's like, well, if nobody applies, there could be another problem. And so we need to figure out how to make sure that either the system is fixed or that how we regulate it changes to ensure these products get to market. Because the challenges we face are great, and the need is great, and we need to find a way of moving forward. So look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Jack, and hopefully all of our lav mics are working now. We can have, as you said, a conversation, and I invite all of you to use slido.com to submit your questions, and we'll take those as we move along here. I'm going to take the liberty as a moderator to start first with a question, because I'm a journalist, for gosh sakes, and so, that's what I do for a living. I'd like each of you, and to start with Governor Ricketts, to talk about a hypothetical here. We're gonna pretend that President Trump is watching, maybe it's executive time, and he's watching USDA Outlook today. What's the one thing that you would suggest as an improvement in the current regulatory process for either plants or animals to the president?
Well, I think that's really hitting on the themes that we already talked about, is that innovation is important in agriculture to be able to meet the kind of two missions that I talked about, which is feeding a growing world, Jack, you talked about this as well, and then making sure we're creating job opportunities. And that means we got to cut the regulatory red tape. We got to look at it. If there's a process that's broken, for example, with FDA, we got to change the process. It's one of the things when I came in as governor, we found a lot of things that we could do better. And I think it's one of the things the Trump administration has done. They've looked to cut, 22 regulations for every one new regulation they put in place. This is an area where it's ripe for really taking a look at what is the regulatory process right now between the FDA and the USDA, and what's not working, so that we can get rid of it and create an environment where companies can be successful, we can innovate, we can feed the growing world, and we can make sure we're creating job opportunities. And I've got to tell you, especially in states like Nebraska, that is just vital. When we're talking about agriculture and making sure that we've got the ability to create new jobs, that is the way we're going to grow my state.
Thank you. Barb?
Yeah, I think I would say to Mr. President, the scientific basis is the power of the United States, and indeed the power of innovation. So we have a broken regulatory process. Bring everybody in the room. I think he likes to do that, and let's fix it. That's kind of what I would do. Thanks.
Yeah, I think the message really is that we're putting ourselves at a competitive disadvantage, and I think we need to have that conversation, and we need to have that conversation sooner than later. And the world's watching, and until we step to the table and start coming up with ways to bring this technology forward, I think we're risking that these technologies are going to go somewhere else.
Yeah, and so I think I would say that really, ultimately, this is a question of leadership. That, that we have a regulatory system. The salmon, I think, is a perfect example. It's an approved product, and all they have to do is, push a button and issue guidance. And so, if it doesn't happen, it's not because the system is broken. It's because the leadership is broken.
All right. Thank you all for that. One of the questions that came in, and Mitch, you alluded to this in your presentation, is are there any gene-edited animal products currently on the global market? You talked about South America.
Yeah, I think there's clearly products that have been approved. Those products have not yet made it to the marketplace today, but one of the conversations came up about whether we can detect these products or not. If these products look just identical to natural animals that are out there, there is a risk that there are products that are gene edited that are out there meeting the needs of the producers and consumers and maybe not part of the regulatory process. And so I think that's one of the things that as we keep moving forward, clearly the transparency about what we are putting in the food chain is really important.
Okay. Jack, is there anything you wanted to add to that? All right. One of the other things that has come up is the need for transparency, as you mentioned, and to build consumer trust. I think that was a kind of a common theme. How do we bridge this disconnect between people who are concerned about global warming and they're concerned about everything from cow flatulence to, all these different things that have been raised as by climate folks who are skeptical of the science, with those of you who know the importance of good science? How do you bridge that disconnect?
Well, I could start. So 10 to 15% of greenhouse gases come from agriculture, another 10 to 15% from deforestation, 80% of which is caused by agriculture. So I know that some of these conversations can be difficult, but for every dollar you invest in wind and solar, you get less than $1 back because they're less efficient than fossil fuels. Now those are long-term investments for our future, but for every dollar you invest in agriculture, you get $1.43 back everywhere in the world, positive rates of return. And so, you have to ask, would consumers rather pay more for their energy or less for their food to get a cleaner environment? And from what I know of Americans, they'd rather eat their way to a cleaner environment. I don't work for the government anymore, so I can say that.
Well, that's a great point, though. I think part of what we have to do is we have to get out there and educate people about what agriculture is doing. One of the things that I always tell people is that farmers and ranchers were the original conservationists, because they took care of the land and their animals because they wanted to pass it on to the next generation. And so they are thinking about ways to be, more global warming friendly, if you want to talk about it that way. For example, if you look at the beef industry here in the United States, and compare it to, say, the beef industry in sub-Saharan Africa or India, they're producing 10 to 50 times more, greenhouse gases in Africa and India with this, than we are here for every cow. Why? Because our system is more efficient. We are doing a better job with the fewer resources. I mentioned, just more beef with fewer animals. That kind of thing actually impacts greenhouse gases. So if this is something you're concerned about, you should think that U.S. agriculture is a hero, because they continue to look for ways to do more with less. We're growing more corn with less water. All that goes into conserving resources for our world. So, and that only happens if there's innovation, if we're looking for ways to do things better. And some of the technologies we're talking about with biotechnology are going to help us accelerate what we're doing, for example, with animal agriculture. Again, we're not talking about the transgenic stuff. We're talking about the stuff that you could do through traditional breeding that Mitch was talking about. You can do with traditional breeding today and take 30 to 50 generations, or you can do it in a single generation and get the results a lot faster to be able to accomplish what you want.
And I want to jump in too. I mentioned that our members are all about communicating with everyone from farm to table, and they're good at it. And so don't underestimate the concept of telling the story. Indeed, we're all invested in agriculture, every one of us, my neighbors, everybody. And I think it's just getting that perspective in front of them. So recently we were having in-depth conversations with folks who support plant-based foods. And we talked about animal welfare and greenhouse gases, and it was just, bad, bad, bad. But what's good, change the perspective. All those foods contain agricultural ingredients. There's a farmer and a farm family that initiates their whole line of products, and that line of products is growing in the marketplace. So let's change some perspectives. Let's have some conversations. I know it seems trite, but that's what we got to do.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that when we talk about climate change and traditional breeding programs, we're not going to have the luxury of 40, 50, 60 years to address the changes that we need to put in our systems. If you go to Florida today, if you go to California today, the dairy industry is dealing with the heat issues already. California, the industry is moving up in elevation, and Florida is one of the people that come and talk to us all the time about some of the issues around heat tolerance. And so I think even though there could be an argument that, well, if traditional breeding works, let's just keep doing that. I think things are changing fast enough. The demand is changing fast enough. The running out of food is coming fast enough that we've got to apply some innovation. We're not going to have the luxury of waiting to solve this problem like we did for the last 50 or 100 years.
Mitch, do you see any new political coalitions perhaps evolving between what you're able to do for animal care and animal rights activists? Are they saying, hey, yeah, this science makes sense?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we need to make sure, and I think the non-browning apple is a great example. I think our dehorned animals are a great example of finding things that the consumer and the activist can understand the reason, understand the need, and spend the time talking about their passion for a solution with the safety of the technology that can provide that solution. And I think going out and talking about visible examples, pictures are great examples, and showing the ability to address those concerns that are out there. The activists have a hard time when you come and talk to them about welfare concerns and you show them a solution. They don't always have the same response that they would if it was an economic driver that was pushing the technology. So as long as we stay focused on our public conversations around talking to consumer about what they're interested in, talking to the activists about what they're passionate about, I think we can put this discussion in a different context than maybe we have in the past 20 years.
Yeah, I think it drives to the motivation that we all have, the motivation to have that conversation about humane animal care between an activist and an animal ag group might be different. But as Jack said, the motivation is we love our food? What did you say? So I think there's ample room to bring groups together when they're similarly motivated and they'll work together.
So I'm going to take the liberty of combining a couple questions here because they're similar in nature. One questioner says consumers worry that plant biotech is not safe despite the evidence, and so you've got safety and all these things that have been proclaimed by the scientists. They want to know if, even though you're right, that doesn't always win the argument. So how do you overcome the emotional segment of that? Anybody want to take a stab at this one?
Well, I think it's one of the things just in general in agriculture, we got to do a better job of telling our story. And I use the example of like my family. My grandfather was a farmer, and I remember going to his farm as a kid. But, that's not the experience my kids have today. And so more and more people don't have that experience directly with where food comes from. So we've got to do in general, we've got to do a better job of talking about where does food come from, what do farmers and ranchers do, how do they care for the land and the animals and so forth. So I think that's a start. And then another thing that I always talk to my team about is you got to have the statistics, right? So you got to show with numbers that you're doing a better job. But I think, Barbara, it also gets to what you were talking about, is you got to have stories. You got to have how somebody's life was impacted by this, how somebody's life was better. And that's part of the education process. When you're talking, Jack, about, if you're being able to help feed that kid someplace because we've done a better job with regard to this or we've impacted somebody's life. I think we got to find those stories that really help demonstrate, when we're trying to overcome some of the objections to this new technology, why this is better, why this actually helps somebody's life become better.
Yeah, and I would just chime into what the governor said. I think a key word there is precision, and for my son, followed by faster, quicker, better, because he's got 2 cell phones and so forth. So I just wanted to throw out the gene editing. I'm going to let the experts talk now, but it's very precise.
Yeah, I guess I approach it from a different perspective because science at the beginning of a conversation just polarizes the audience. Those who agree with you more, and those who disagree more. So if you lead with science, you will lose with science. And so I was having this conversation with, I think, 800 meat scientists a few years ago, as exciting as it sounds. And I said, if people don't trust you, science doesn't matter. And if people do trust you, science doesn't matter. Stop telling people what you do and tell them why you do it, which of course is getting to the governor's point. If they understand the why, they generally don't care about the what. So I think we really need to talk about, why do we do this? And I think farmers, of course, have some of the best stories because they do it for very good reasons. But I think the scientists, too, are really passionate about the problems they're trying to solve. So explaining why people go into this business, why they do what they do, I think is important because then you build trust. And it's only at the point that you have trust that science has any role to play in the conversation. We need to get to science, but we need to start with trust.
Other thoughts on that?
Oh, I agree. I think it's out there in front of people. Talk about why we're doing this, what are we trying to address, and really look at the pull for the technology versus the push of the technology. And I think most scientists will push this technology because they're excited about it. I think we really need to focus on what is that pull and societal needs for the technology, and what are we trying to address with it.
Do any of you believe that the advances that gene editing has a potential for solving human health issues? Is that going to bleed into helping adoption in agriculture, or is that going to be more hurtful? I mean, I think of the Chinese example where they went ahead and with the twins. Jack?
So I don't think it matters very much. I know a lot of people think, well, why do people like biotech and drugs, but they don't like it in health? And Daniel Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for prospect theory and economic and psychology theory. It basically says, when you're in a loss situation, like I'm sick, you're willing to take a chance to get better. But when you're feeling healthy, you're not willing to take any chance, even if the chance is 0. And so, it actually makes perfect sense how people are responding and reacting to this. It's just human nature. So I'm not sure that it has as much of an impact as people would like for it to or worry about having.
Any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would say, Jack, would you agree with this, that we don't bring in the human health dialogue when we're talking about food animals and agriculture? So that's one of the things that I think is important too, because that just causes the...
There are moral, ethical concerns that you
Yes,
don't
we get into
necessarily
the
have to
ethical
have.
concerns. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Another question from the audience, a statement first. Americans have an expectation the government is responsible for keeping the food supply safe, but how do you meet the public's expectations without regulation?
I don't think anybody's asked to not have regulation. I think we've asked about regulation that is based on the product, the risk, and safety. And so if we harvest meat or we harvest milk from a animal that has been gene edited and we compare that to meat or milk from an animal that has not been gene edited and they're 100% identical, I ask the question, what is the risk? And so as long as we've got a risk-based assessment out there that's doing post-market surveillance and asking the question about the products in the marketplace, I think we have a regulation that makes sense. Today we have a regulation that is, if you start the process by doing this, you have to go down a completely different pathway. And I think that's very different than saying we're not interested in having the technology regulated. We want a regulation that makes sense based on the risk and the safety of the product.
Yeah, I'd say a couple of things. One, consumers have never cared more nor known less how their food is produced, and that's a challenge. But it's also a challenge. We have the safest food supply in the history of the world, and we have people that are more concerned than they have ever been. And so, we're hardwired to worry. We're going to worry about something. And so, if you don't need to worry about food safety, they're going to worry about chemicals in their food. And, so how we talk about these things is really important. And, people say if you can't pronounce the ingredients, you shouldn't eat it. Well, all food is made of chemicals, and I can't pronounce any of them. We're made of chemicals. So, what does that help the conversation? And so, we need to have a conversation that's, a little bit more basic in order to, figure out how to get people to have a little lower level of concern.
And just to follow up on that, we were talking a little bit earlier about the national pork producers and their advocacy for making sure that animal products are regulated by USDA rather than FDA. So I'd like your thoughts on whether that's a move that should be made.
I'll start. As I said, we definitely need to improve the process that we have. And as Jack said, is it a political issue or is it a scientific issue? Let's peel that onion back. And we definitely support USDA being key and being at the table. I mean, I can't stress that enough. They understand agricultural animals and biotechnology as well. So that's where we start. And let's fix what's broken.
Governor, anybody else want to talk about which body should be the regulatory agency?
Well, I think most companies really don't care who does it as long as it's done in a transparent, predictable, and science-based way, and that there aren't political considerations that keep safe products from market. So, ultimately we don't care. But if we can't regulate things in a science-based way at FDA, then we should consider whether or not there's an additional role for USDA or whether or not there's another path that should happen. Because, the time is short. 2050 will be here in a blink of an eye. And so we need not one or two products every year. We need dozens or hundreds of products coming out, if we're going to address these challenges. So we need a system that's fit for purpose.
So one of the things that when you talked about 20 years, I mean, who wants to start up a company and try to secure investments that's going to take 20 years to bring to market? I mean, this is just insane. And Governor, you have really hit the nail on the head about job creation and the impact that can have in your state when some of these companies do come in. What do you see as kind of the future pathway for you to entice more biotech firms into the state of Nebraska and that job creation?
Yeah, so one of the things we've done is we've created kind of a biotech connector, if you want to kind of think of it, it's a kind of a facilitator or an incubator, whatever you want to call it, on the campus of the University of Nebraska to create a space. It's about 7,700 square feet where it's got a wet lab, access to mentors, so you get really a place, and it's invested by the U.S. Department of Commerce. our Department of Economic Development. We've got Nebraska, which is a local Nebraska biotech companies getting together in their organization. Invest Nebraska, which invests in these types of companies from the state level. So really trying to bring together all the different players to help encourage this, because we see the biotech industry as one that is huge and growing. So it's about a $670 million or billion dollar a year industry right now, but it's growing like at 7% a year. So this is a great opportunity, again, to create those jobs that our young people want to be able to find their careers in Nebraska and make sure that we're keeping our people and we're attracting people from across the country. And so we're trying to facilitate and encourage that in our state. And kind of get back to your other question about the regulation, is that's where, again, we need to make sure we're not putting up barriers, that we're following good science-based principles, risk assessment, and really kind of using common sense on some of these things, like the USDA has done on the plant side with regard to how this grows. And I kind of illustrated in my opening remarks about using the example of corn and how that productivity has increased so much since the 1940s, and what that's meant for us to be able to feed this growing world. And if you look at value-added agriculture being a key way that we can increase the economic activity in states like Nebraska, we need to be able to have that same type of innovation. And so, again, USDA has said that if it's something you can do naturally, great. And that's the same kind of approach we need to have when it comes to animals. If this is something we can accomplish through breeding, then why are we putting all sorts of extra layers of red tape on it if basically what we're doing is accelerating it? And just keeping that good science in mind about how we're establishing these rules so that we don't create those obstacles, because I think, as Mitch pointed out, other countries are going to figure this out, and they're going to put us at a competitive disadvantage, and then that investment will move out of the United States and go to those other countries.
Thank you. So that's a good segue to a question that came from the audience about the fact that we've talked about the U.S. regulatory situation, and there's been reference to Argentina and Brazil and Australia. One of our questioners wants to know, what about the EU? What's the regulatory environment like there?
I'm happy to start. I was in the UK just 2 days ago, speaking to 1,000 farmers at the National Farmers Union, and perhaps one of the only bright spots for them in Brexit is the fact that they can now pursue innovation in a way that they were not able to within the European Union. If you remember the map that I put up, we have a lot of our genetic engineering work is done in Hungary. We've got our L-Lactis platform in Belgium. Our mosquitoes are in Oxitec in the UK. So there's a huge amount of expertise over there, and it's just being exported to other places to develop these technologies. And so, I think that, it is a bit of a wasteland in terms of opportunity in the EU for these technologies. There's no path to market for any technology. And, unfortunately, the farmers in Europe have the worst of all worlds, because they're competing against imported GMOs, and they can't use the technology, and so it puts them at a disadvantage. And when you look at the landscape in Europe, there's this push for using fewer resources and pesticides, and the cost is that Europe imports 70% of its animal feed needs, and the country that sends the most food to Europe is Brazil, and 80% of deforestation is agricultural. So Europe has exported its environmental footprint to the most biodiverse country on the planet. That might not be a good idea.
Yeah, I just piggyback on that I think the regulatory environment in Europe shows what happens when you go too far down this path of blocking innovation and technology. And that's frankly, one of the trade barriers with the European Union, is they use that as a protective, their protectionism against our biotechnology. And it's been a huge issue for states like Nebraska with regard to getting markets in Europe open, because they use these non-tariff trade barriers to block our products going in there, unless they absolutely need them, in which case then they'll turn a blind eye to it. But it is a big problem. And I've talked to, I actually led a trade mission to the European Union in 2015, where we talked to officials at the EU, and they admitted, we know there's no scientific reason for blocking this, but it's a political one. There's a lot of, consumer resistance, groups that are out there creating trouble to block this kind of technology. So they admit it's absolutely a political situation. It has nothing to do with the science or the safety of the products coming in.
And I think you're already seeing the EU suffer some of that competitive disadvantage. The Secretary talked about the branding and being able to use names that have been around for a long time to protect that product in that marketplace. But when you go to the EU and you start asking about each one of those countries and their local farmers and their local products and what they're trying to do and accomplish with the societal concerns around, in our case, animal welfare, with the ban on castration, at the same point, some of the environmental impact, and you talk to an international genetics company like Hendrix that's sitting there in Europe, and they're realizing that they're not going to be able to meet the demands that society and the environment's putting on them, so they're reaching out to the technology. If you go to Ireland, the number one concern in Ireland surveyed within their dairy industry is dehorning of cattle. So they're going to start feeling more and more of this pull towards what does our food production system look like, as well as the results of the competitive disadvantage they're going to find themselves in. So they're going to come to a head just like we will at some point. And I think you can look at Europe and start looking at the impact with shunning innovation has caused, and get a good read as to what the potential problems could be coming down the road.
Yeah, and I think that the current trade framework that we have, NAS is very supportive of a U.S.-UK free trade agreement, a U.S.-EU free trade agreement, but we need strong agriculture chapters. And as Jack started with, the UK will be a different animal, if you will, than dealing with the EU on that point. So we need more global trade, and these technologies are a part of that conversation.
And I think we also need more transparency because, in Europe there's this feeling that they've rejected GMOs, they have no benefit to them, but all the beer, wine, and cheese in Europe are produced with GMOs. It's just that in Europe, if it's made from a GMO, it must be labeled. If it's made with a GMO, it doesn't have to be. Well, all the products made with are European products, and all the products made from apparently are ours. And so, I don't think consumers care about the difference, but that distinction hides the fact from consumers, and therefore they don't know how important it is to their daily lives.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of our next questions from the audience talks about what about people, among which there are many, who still want access to a marketplace that continues to offer non-GMO, non-biotech altered food options. And I always think about the fact that so many people like beer, wine, and cheese, and biotech's there in the background, and there's not really an awareness of that, as well as the science that goes into many other products. But regardless, do you see a bifurcation in the market where there'll be a certain type of non-GMO, presumably natural, and then the more science-based products? Or do you see that the science will eventually rule the day and there'll be an adoption of more and more biotech products?
Yeah, I'll kick off. I think that it's a good question, but really providing that choice on the, what do we call it, the non-GMO products, I think that's a choice. I think there's a farm family face behind there somewhere in terms of identity preservation. So I think we're going to, in the landscape of food retail, yes, we're going to have more buckets of different kinds of products. I think the key is that we look at this strategically and as a net positive to provide that choice, understand agriculture is a key part of that, and move forward. So I'm not discounting the biotech crop and seed traits, but also if there's this market that's viable for non-GMO, I think that we let that grow. It's market-based.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I mean, I think that there's always going to be different places in the market for products to exist. I think consumers that ask and are willing to pay for it will find the opportunity to purchase those items. But I think strategically is a great word. When we start looking at things around health and environmental impact, resources, there are going to be some decisions made about what we can tolerate, what we can't tolerate, that are independent of a consumer's interest in a specific market niche. But the reality is that the consumer is always going to be able to find what they want, because if there's a demand and people are willing to pay for it, there will be someone that's willing to come in and supply that. If we can afford to produce it in the lands available and the resources available, that marketplace will be filled with a product.
Yeah, so I'd say, all consumers want natural products. I assume they don't mean salmonella, Ebola, and Zika, which are all natural, but we all think happy thoughts when we hear the word natural. I think it's clearly important that people have choice, but I think it's important for those who want that choice to remember that in the last year, 40% of Americans did not have enough money at a certain point in time to buy all the food they wanted. Right. And those people are not out there advocating for policy changes. They're just out there trying to feed their families.
Yeah, I think that's a great point there, Jack, that absolutely there's going to be consumer choice, and we should encourage that. We want that. We want consumers to have that choice. but some of the choices that a consumer might make in the United States and pay a premium for it is also not the way we're going to feed people in Africa.
Good point. Barb, you alluded to this earlier about the link between plant breeding and the potential for like nutraceuticals or health-based crops. I know Ohio State's doing a lot of research on that in conjunction with their School of Medicine. What do you see from the different state level folks that you connect with about the potential for having actually, extra nutrition or cancer addressing components in food that has been produced through biotech?
Well, I think those are all traits that are on the table, that they're choices that R&D firms can jump on. I think they're very important. At the state level, we have companies that are pursuing some of these. I'll talk about the nutritional traits, and that's already been pursued. They're already approved. So I think that the health benefits are a huge emerging platform. If you're talking about using plants or animals to develop human pharmaceuticals, that's a different use of biotechnology, and that's also a viable platform as well. So I'll let Mitch and Jack respond to that
Yeah, you're
too.
doing some of that.
Well,
Mitch
I
is
mean, I
doing
think the golden rice example that was brought up is a great example of kind of technology pushing. That here's a product that came out clearly scientifically, nutritionally, you can rationalize that this product has value. But was there a big pull coming from the consumer side in that? There is a transgenic pig that didn't put as much phosphorus in the environment. That pig has gone to the wayside as well because, again, the consumer and the society wasn't asking for type of products to address those things. It wasn't high enough on the radar screen, or the passion wasn't there. And so our strategy has really been to focus on those traits. We can deliver a lot of traits. We're focused on the ones that we believe there is a demand for. We believe there's a forum to talk about the welfare, the health of animals, disease resistance, the ability to help address some of the antibiotic use in the food chain. And so the focus for us is really to reach out to the consumer and to the demand that we believe is out there and address those things that we know will help pull this technology through the marketplace. I think once we get people comfortable that the technology works, it's safe, I think some of these other opportunities will become much more evident to the consumer of what the benefit is. But again, I don't think pushing technology out there is going to get us where we need to be.
Yeah, I would just say that whenever we talk about products coming in the pipeline, we have non-browning avocados, and generally that's all you have to say, and then people are like, I'm in.
Me too. Oh, that's great. So one of the other questions that has come up is that are there any differences in the way that beginning or younger farmers should be adopting technology that you've seen? I know that some of the research that we've done and also the work that Aimpoint Research has done, we've written about recently, is all about how the next generation of farmers is all in on tech. They are all about innovation. They really want to be the ones to bring a lot of new things back to the farm. And so I'm just curious, are you seeing adoption levels differently by the next generation coming into agriculture as perhaps those who are at the later edges of their career in farming?
Well, I guess my comment would be that it's very interesting. You go out and you talk to these young people coming back to the farm, and their biggest fear is losing the family farm. And they're willing to do what it takes to make sure that that doesn't fall on their generation or on their lineage within their family. So you can have the conversation about, what does technology afford and what is the opportunity to make sure that they can keep the family farm together, that they can be competitive, that they are going to be successful. And so I think their willingness to engage in those discussions is great. And I think their ability to have a unbiased a view as to what is that opportunity for them and personally what can they do with that opportunity. I find those conversations fun to have because they're pulling on the information. They're interested in it. You don't have to force them to have the conversation. They're coming to you to have that conversation.
And I would say in the States, the next gen young farmers, they're technology hungry, and they know more how to apply that than even we do, perhaps, in some sense. So they're business people, they're strategists, and they want the newest and the latest technology when they have the ability to have the capital investment behind it. So I would add on that what we're talking about here on innovation, I think, is really about human resource capital and talent. So this is critical to the conversation we're having right now, is that we continue to build those new beginning farmers who have that hunger for the technology, and the people they employ do as well, and that we're training new and young people to understand all of these technologies so that they're poised to implement when we get them through the regulatory process.
I would just say that I think there's a misunderstanding that organic farms look like they did 100 years ago, and the organic farms I've seen are pretty high tech, and they're using big data, and they're looking at robotics and all of these other things, and so I think the lines have blurred in a lot of ways that people don't get. And the organic farming is critical for the diversity of our food system. I mean, a lot of big farmers are using cover crops today, and they're doing it precisely because some organic farmer believed in her heart it was the right thing to do, and big data came along and proved it right. So, yeah.
So one of the themes that just came up in this thread is the need for training. So Governor, could you share a little bit about what's happening in Nebraska in terms of trying to train the next gen of not only farmers but business people?
Yeah, absolutely. One of the things that we have done is we created a grant program at the state level called the Developing Youth Talent Initiative. And it really is trying to get young people starting in 7th and 8th grade interested in the career fields where we have high demand. And so what it does, it's a grant that encourages private sector companies to work with school systems starting in that 7th and 8th grade time frame to expose them to these kind of career opportunities that then hopefully they follow through in a career academy in high school. And then actually I've also proposed a new program called the Nebraska Talent Scholarship Program to provide scholarships, $4,000 a year scholarships, either 2-year or 4 years, so but the entire way through that in those high demand areas. For example, rangeland management, if you're talking about in the western part of our state, but also industrial technology, information technology, healthcare as well, math, engineering, all those kind of career fields where we've got high demand so that young people can find out about it early on and really start preparing themselves and then really help facilitate them getting that great career education that they need to be able to take the jobs that we've got available, because we've got a ton of jobs available. Like 50,000 jobs are open in Nebraska right now. Anybody wants to move to Nebraska, we've probably got a job for you. We got lots of jobs open. But that's what we know that we're going to have to grow a lot of those young people up to be able to take those jobs. And so we're very focused at the state level of helping connect those young people to those jobs.
Well, thank you. Great advertising opportunity there. A good quality of life too, right?
Absolutely.
Houses are
Best
cheaper.
place in the world, guys.
That's terrific. So we're getting near the end of our session here, and I will ask each of our panelists to make some wrap-up comments before we end up. But I think one of the things that I wanted to make sure that we also talked about is just that, what are some of the things that perhaps you'd like to see from USDA, since this is a USDA-sponsored forum, to maybe facilitate either training or more research. We just passed a farm bill, for example. It's got a nice research title. Are there any things that come to mind when you think of farm bill and USDA related that you would like to see to better enhance the adoption of biotechnology?
I'm going to jump in first. One of the new provisions in the Farm Bill is enhancing an animal health portfolio to enhance animal health. And I think, as I asserted, I would say to USDA, let's get at the table and fix this regulatory process so we can actually take that seriously and improve animal agricultural health writ large through the innovations we've been talking about today. So.
All right, thank you. Anyone else?
Let me just build up on that just because that's so important for my state as well. So as I mentioned, agriculture is our #1 industry. And if you look at animal agriculture, and I'm going to specifically take the beef side of it though, you're talking about, just the beef side is like half of that, or not half, it's about a quarter of it all. But I mean, just the beef side of that, the animal agriculture is about half. So when you're looking at something like that, that is important for us to be able to continue to develop that market. Livestock is value-added agriculture. It's taking the things we grow, whether it's the corn or the soybeans, and turning it into something more valuable. And we have the highest quality beef and pork and all those sort of great things that the world is demanding right now. When we see the demand for protein increasing, especially you think about Asia, that's a huge opportunity for us. So to whatever USDA can do to help us facilitate that with regard to making sure animal agriculture continues to innovate and grow is going to be something that helps grows our economy, grows our ability to create jobs in our state, ultimately is going to be able to help us feed the demand of the growing world. So it's a key thing for USDA to keep a big picture of what's going on in the world with regard to what do we have to accomplish with regard to feeding that world, and then how do we facilitate that in a way that is going to help states like Nebraska create those job opportunities. And that value-added agriculture through livestock is a key way to do it. So 100% on board what you're saying, Barb.
Thank you, Governor.
So I would just say that given that 100% of people eat food, and given the returns on investment of ag investments, I think one might expect that our investments in agricultural research and development would be fairly similar to our investments in health. Of course, they're only 1%. And so I think that there's just this huge demand for investment that would have amazing returns for our economy and the global economy as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, my comment, I'll just go in a little different direction. I think facilitating communication is absolutely imperative. I've been in front of Whole Foods, I've been in front of McDonald's, I've been in front of Walmart on both this job and my previous job. I think any opportunity at a state or federal level to get people in the room to engage in the discussion, to get people in the room that feel comfortable raising the issues they'd like to raise, I think we just need to get out there and find the right forum. And this is a great group to talk to, but it was expensive for people to come here. These are not necessarily people that just want to come and talk about a situation that they're passionate about. And so I think any opportunity we can get to sponsor, support, or identify forums and opportunities to get people on the stage that are willing to have the discussion, engage in the discussion about the need for innovation, how we can solve some of the problems out there, I think is absolutely imperative to get not only the public acceptance, people to get to understand, but put a little pressure on the regulatory environment as well to get this through.
All right, thank you.
But if I could just tag on one last thing there too, I think the other thing the USDA could help with is, we talked about those stories and a human face on this, and really looking for those ways to help communicate in different ways that reach people's hearts, because that's, to Jack's point, they're not going to agree with you on the science, or they're going to agree with your science, but it starts with trying to help people understand why this is important from a human perspective, how it impacts people's lives. I think that's one of the key things USDA could help us do, is tell that story about how this impacts people.
Terrific. All right, I think we'll start with you, Jack, and just if you want to make a minute or two summary statements as we close out our panel and share your final thoughts.
Well, I'll make this short. First, I hope that you do agree that Intraxon is the coolest company you've never heard of. The second point, I would just urge you that if these are issues that you care about, that you make your voices heard. So it's just important that the farming and ag community participate in these conversations, because they're really important, and there are a lot of you. And I know that people are really, really busy, but it helps to pick up the phone and call your representative, or to reach out to the government and let them know what your positions are, whatever they are. Be part of the conversation.
Thanks.
Yeah, I would support that. Time is of an essence. We can't keep kicking the can down the road. I think we need to engage in discussions and have those hard discussions. We still have regulation that's based on definitions that were developed long before Watson and Crick knew what the structured DNA was. When I was in graduate school, we were talking about sequencing genomes. We thought all the answers would be there. We come to computational power, and now we put these things together and we have answers and questions that we can ask that we've never done before, and we now have the tools to put those into play to solve these problems. And I think we just need to take the opportunity to make sure that we can capitalize on all the investments we've made and bring it to the marketplace in a way that does make a difference for people.
Thank you. Barb?
Yeah, well, for our global competitiveness and for just societal well-being writ large, we must continue to commercialize and bring these innovations to practical application. So the commissioners, secretaries, and directors of ag in every state, in your state, they want these tools in the toolbox. Don't take a tool away from a farmer and a rancher. Let's put them back in. Let's keep piling them in. So that's what we look forward to from this process.
Thank you, Governor.
And then I would just end by saying, I think that we're all probably in this room because we're part of this mission, and I can't think of a more noble mission of feeding a growing world. That's what we do in Nebraska. And if we're going to continue to do that, to be able to continue on that mission and meet the demands that we've got in the future, we've got to continue to innovate. And so that's one of the things that we're all here together to keep the eye on the big picture of what we're trying to accomplish and what we're trying to do and why it's so important that we're successful in what we're doing. And that also helps us in states like Nebraska where, again, agriculture is what we do. This is going to help us create those job opportunities for our young people to be able to find the career that they want and be able to continue to enjoy the great quality of life we've got in Nebraska. Nebraska is the best place in the world to live, work, and raise a family. And we want our people growing up there and you all to move there to be able to help enjoy that. So, and agriculture is going to be a key way that we do that. If we're going to grow Nebraska, we have to grow agriculture, and that's why I think we're all in here to be able to keep that bigger picture of feeding that world, and it benefits us here in our states to be able to do that. So we've got to continue to find ways to innovate and be successful.
All right, well, thank you very much. I'd like you to join me in thanking our panelists. So now it's time for lunch, and I'm sure that'll be a great opportunity for networking, and then the sessions resume at 1:45. So thank you to USDA and the Ag Outlook Board and everyone for this opportunity.